Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are looking at the bureaucratic fallout after a huge legal battle at the patent office.
Right, we're moving past all the courtroom drama.
Exactly. And we're digging into the cleanup manual, MPT Chapter 2300, specifically Section 2315, which is all about the action after a derivation proceeding is decided.
That's right. And just as a quick refresher for everyone, a derivation proceeding is, well, it's essentially a trial run by the Patent Trial and Appeal Board. We just call it the board.
Okay.
Its whole job is to figure out if an inventor on one application actually, stole or derived the invention from someone else's work without their permission.
So it's all about originality.
Exactly. It's a feature of the AIA's first inventor-to-file system, making sure the true inventor gets the patent.
So our mission today is to really unpack the administrative side of that ruling. We want to see how the examiner, who's been waiting on the sidelines this whole time, takes the board's decision and turns it into real action.
And these are concrete actions, rejections, new searches, a ton of paperwork. It all permanently shapes that patent applications file.
So let's start there. The proceeding is over. What's the first thing that happens?
It's a massive transfer of authority. The board mails its decision, and boom, jurisdiction just snaps right back to the primary examiner.
So it's their problem again.
It's their problem again, and it's not a suggestion, it's an immediate instruction.
So the examiner doesn't really get to interpret the ruling. What's their first required duty once that judgment lands on their desk?
Their duty is to take appropriate action, and that's a direct quote. They have to act in precise accordance with whatever the board recommended in its judgment.
And if the judgment went against the applicant?
Then the examiner has to immediately enforce that finding. No delay.
I have to ask, though, if the board ruled against an applicant, that applicant is probably not happy. How does the MPP stop the examiner from, being punitive or overreaching?
That's a really crucial point about fairness. The MPEP is very specific. It says the examiner has to enter the rejections that the judgment suggested.
Enter, not create.
Right. And then they have to maintain those rejections unless the applicant can somehow overcome them. The key is that the rejection comes from the legal finding of derivation itself. It's not some new prior art rejection the examiner just came up with.
So it's rooted in the board's decision.
Exactly. It's an instruction to enforce the law as the board determined it. The applicant, of course, gets a chance to respond. Maybe they can amend their claims or find new evidence, but the bar is incredibly high at that point.
That makes the board's judgment so powerful. It's basically forcing the losing party to deal with a rejection that says, you didn't actually invent this.
Precisely. And the whole system's integrity depends on the examiner carrying that out clearly and quickly.
Okay, let's talk about the claims themselves, because the judgment is really a life or death sentence for them. What happens to the claims that were at the heart of the dispute?
This is where we get the concept of claims being finally disposed of. If a claim was directly decided against the applicant in that judgment, it's done. Permanently struck from the record.
Permanently struck. That sounds very final. What does finally disposed of actually mean in practice compared to just a regular rejection?
It means the examiner takes zero further action on those specific claims. They are procedurally dead.
Wow.
And what's critical is this bypasses the normal appeal process. The applicant can't just appeal the examiner's action on that claim because the action is based on the board's final ruling. If you lost on that claim in the derivation, that claim is finished.
But what if, not every single claim in the application might have been part of the proceeding, right? Let's say they proved derivation on claim 1, but claims 2 through 5 weren't really discussed. What happens to those?
Great question. The examiner can't just let them slide. The entire application is now, you can say, tainted by this finding of derivation. So for any claims that weren't fully resolved by the judgment, the examiner has a new duty. They have to conduct an updated prior art search specifically for those remaining claims.
So even if you sort of won or had some claims that weren't involved, you're still facing a fresh examination.
Absolutely. The examiner can then reopen prosecution based on what that new search finds. The MPT requires this because the first search might have been too narrow. This just ensures every single allowed claim is independently patentable.
Okay, what about the worst case scenario? The judgment is just a total loss. What's the procedural guillotine for the whole application?
Well, if the end result of all this is that every single claim is found unallowable, either by the board directly or by the examiner after that new search, then the examiner issues a notice of abandonment.
And that's it. The file is closed.
The file is closed. The applicant has lost their shot at getting a patent for that invention.
We've covered the legal fallout. Now let's get into what you called the messy reality of paperwork. Here's where it gets really interesting.
You're right. This is where the bureaucratic rubber meets the road. The board establishes the legal truth, but that truth has to be perfectly reflected in the USPTO's official records.
And these aren't just minor typos we're talking about.
No, not at all. They're described as rare, but when these corrections happen, the stakes are incredibly high. A mistake in these records could get a patent invalidated in court years down the road.
So let's start with the big one, inventorship. The board says person A stole the invention from person B. Person A's application is now, well, fundamentally wrong. How does the examiner fix it?
If the board's judgment orders a correction of inventorship, the examiner has to make it happen. It's usually done with a document called an application data sheet, or ADS.
But wait a minute. If the board just ruled against the losing applicant, how do you get them to sign the form that basically admits they weren't the real inventor and hands over the rights? That sounds difficult.
That is the real-world headache, absolutely. But the rules anticipate it. Often the board's judgment itself can act as the legal trigger for the change. And the winning party has ways to petition for the correction. The goal, no matter what, is to make sure the official file shows the correct inventor, the one who did not derive the invention.
And of course, inventorship is tied directly to ownership. So if the application was assigned to a company based on the wrong inventor, that record has to change too.
100%. If the whole entitlement to the patent has shifted, the official assignment records have to be updated. That means new paperwork, a new cover sheet, all formally recorded. The stakes are huge because who the owner is determines who can legally act on the application.
That sounds like another legal fight just waiting to happen. Who can sign what? Who hires the lawyer? So if ownership gets messy, what about just the day-to-day stuff?
You also have to correct the correspondence address and the power of attorney, the legal representative.
Of course.
I mean, if the rights completely transferred from Company A to Company B, the USPTO can't keep sending mail to Company A. The examiner has to make sure the file is updated so all communication goes to the rightful owner.
This whole process sounds like an administrative minefield. A regular examiner is suddenly handling post-judgment corrections on inventorship, ownership. Is there any kind of safety net built into the MPPP for that?
There is, and it's maybe the most important administrative rule in this whole section. Because the risk is so high, examiners are explicitly instructed to consult a technology center practice specialist.
The specialist, that's the safeguard. Why is that consultation mandatory?
It's mandatory because the examiner has to get it right. They need to confirm the procedures and ensure total compliance with the law, specifically 35 U.S.C. 135B.
So the specialist is the final check?
They're the final check to make sure the administrative changes to inventorship to ownership perfectly match the board's legal judgment. It's all about preventing a future court challenge based on a flawed record. That's why the MPP makes it a requirement.
So what does this all mean? Let's try to connect all these dots for you, the listener.
Okay. A decided derivation proceeding really boils down to two immediate consequences.
The first one being the legal and procedural side of things.
Right. The claims are either immediately rejected because of the derivation, or the application gets sent back for a really tough re-examination with new prior art searches. The examiner is actively enforcing the board's ruling.
And the second consequence is the administrative and record-keeping realignment.
Exactly. The fundamental records, who the inventor is, who owns it, who can speak for it, all of that must be corrected to match the legal truth the board established. That's what MPP Section 2315 is all about, ensuring consistency and fairness.
That focus on consulting the specialist really highlights the friction here. It's not just fixing a typo, it's confirming who legally controls a very valuable piece of intellectual property.
It does, and it raises an interesting question for you to think about. The MPP says to consult them for complex remedies. So imagine this. The board corrects inventorship, but the original assignment on the application was split 50-50 between two companies.
Okay.
And one of those companies has since gone bankrupt. What kind of unexpected administrative nightmare could that create? What would the examiner need the specialist guidance for then?
Wow, that immediately complicates who has the right to even prosecute the application. If it's now co-owned by a healthy company and a defunct one, who signs the papers to move forward?
Does the board's ruling on inventorship somehow override the normal assignment rules? Or does the examiner have to demand that a legal representative be appointed for the bankrupt company?
Those are the kinds of tough questions that really go way beyond standard patent examination.
A provocative thought to mull over, for sure.
We would like to extend a special thank you to Mike Shepard, the creative director who organized this entire audio series.
And as always, a quick disclaimer. This summary of the MPEP was generated using AI tools, including ChatGPT and NotebookLM, and may contain errors or omissions. It is provided for general educational and informational purposes only and is not legal advice or a substitute for formal instruction. For authoritative guidance, consult the official MPEP, a qualified instructor, or registered patent practitioner.